Okay, so we're about to dive into one of the absolute strangest stories in the history of international law. I'm talking about a huge legal fight over nuclear bombs that didn't really end. I mean, there was no winner, no loser. The entire case just kind of vanished. And this right here, this is the quote from the final judgment that makes the whole thing so bizarre. The court says the claim no longer had any object. Like, what does that even mean? It's like the highest court on the planet looked at this massive lawsuit and just said, you know what? Never mind. So that's the big question, right? How does a legal battle over nuclear bombs just poof, vanish? That's the mystery we're going to solve today. And trust me, the answer is a whole lot weirder and honestly more brilliant than you'd expect. Okay, let's get into it. The case that vanished. So where did this all start? Well, it begins with something you can't even see, fallout, drifting silently across the Pacific. All right, so back in May 1973, France is busy conducting these atmospheric nuclear tests way out in the South Pacific. Now, for New Zealand, this is a huge problem because all that radioactive fallout, it's drifting over and landing on their territory. So what do? They take France to court. Not just any court, the International Court of Justice. New Zealand's argument was pretty straightforward. They said, hey, these French nuclear tests are illegal. It wasn't just annoying. They argued it violated their rights, their sovereignty, and what they wanted was simple. They wanted the court to issue an order telling France to stop, period. So you'd think this would be the start of a long legal drama, right? Well, not so fast. France decided they weren't going to play along. And these two documents right here really tell the whole story. On one side, you've got New Zealand's official court application, all formal and by the book. And on the other, France's response, which wasn't a legal argument at all. It was basically a letter saying, no thanks. So France sends this letter saying the court is, and I'm quoting here, manifestly not competent. Basically, they're saying, you have no power over us. Their argument was that their nuclear program was for national defense, so it was none of the court's business. They said they wouldn't participate, wouldn't send a lawyer, nothing. They just wanted the case dropped. It's what's known as the empty chair strategy. So what happens now? I mean, what can a court even do when one of the main parties just refuses to show up? Well, the court didn't back down. Despite France's boycott, they decided to move forward. And on June 22nd, 1973, the court made a big move. It issued something called an order for provisional measures. And for New Zealand, this was a massive win, even if it was just a temporary one. So what exactly are provisional measures? The easiest way to think about it is like the court's pause button. It's a temporary order that basically says, okay, everybody freeze. Stop what you're doing so no more damage is done while we figure this whole thing out. And the court's order was super specific. It told France to avoid nuclear tests causing the deposit of radioactive fallout on the territory of New Zealand. In other words, they pretty much gave New Zealand exactly what they asked for, at least for now. And they did it while France's chair was still empty. A pretty bold move. All right, so the stage is set, right? We've got a huge showdown looming. But then, the plot twist. And it doesn't come from the courtroom. It comes straight from Paris. So throughout 1974, something interesting starts happening. Top French officials, we're talking the president himself, start making public statements. In June, there's a press release that says France will be moving to underground testing. Then in July, the president holds a press conference and says flat out that the 1974 tests will be the last of their kind. The foreign minister says it too at the UN. Now, to most people, this just sounds like politics, right? Just announcements. But the judges at the International Court of Justice, they were listening. And they were taking notes. Because these public promises were about to become the key that unlocked this whole mystery. And this brings us to this really cool legal idea called a unilateral declaration. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the concept is simple. It means that when a country makes a public promise with the intent to be bound by it, that promise can become legally binding on the world stage. It's like saying your word is your bond, but for an entire nation. So the court looked at all those French press conferences and statements and said, you know what? This wasn't just cheap talk. This was a formal promise. They decided that France, all on its own, had just created a legally binding obligation to stop the tests. They were bound by their own words. So let's just walk through the court's logic here because it's actually pretty clever. Step 1. What was New Zealand's whole goal? To stop the atmospheric tests. Okay. Step 2. What did France just do? They went out and publicly promised over and over to stop them. Step 3. The court rules that this promise is now legally binding. So, step 4, this means New Zealand has already gotten what it wanted. Which brings us to the final conclusion, step 5. The original fight is over. There's nothing left to argue about. The case is moved. And this line from the judgment really says it all. The court concludes that France had assumed an obligation. See, the court didn't order France to do anything. It just pointed out that France had already tied its own hands with its public promises.
It really all comes down to a simple before and after. Before France made those promises, the big question was, should the court force France to stop? But after France made those promises, the reality on the ground had changed. Now, France was legally required to stop on its own. The original question didn't matter anymore. And that is why the claim no longer had any object. The case disappeared because its job was already done.
Pretty wild, right? It's a really creative way to resolve a conflict. But what's the big lesson here? Why are we still talking about this case all these years later? Because this case set a huge precedent. It established that a country's public promises can be just as powerful, just as legally binding, as a formal treaty. Think about that. A statement made at a press conference could, in theory, carry the weight of international law. It's a reminder that words really, really matter on the world stage. And that really leaves us with one final big question to chew on. This case answered the problem back in 1974, but it created a much bigger question for all of us today. In our world of 24/7 news and social media, where leaders are constantly speaking, when does a politician's promise stop being just a promise and start becoming international law?